Not one, not two, not three, but all four running boards.
So all part of today's video, I'll be comparing these 4 different running boards I've used on my truck over the last year. Now I have them in order there, from the first ones I got to the most recent ones, the first, second, third generation, and then of course the motorized one just over here. I'll walk you through strictly my opinion based, what's best, what's worse, and the pluses and minuses of each of them all throughout this video. I'm gonna work through these one by one, starting with what I'm calling the Generation 1 running board right here. This is the first one I ever had on the truck. A few of the pluses. This seems to be probably the most sturdy and stout of all the ones I've received. So obviously that's a plus. Also probably the toughest and most durable of the 4 that I put on. I showed in a previous video how I hit a pretty good sized rock doing some off-roading stuff, and I really bent up one of these brackets, I mean really bad. And while I'll get more to this in a little bit, I'm not sure if any of the other 3 boards that we'll be reviewing today would have held up and would have given me the same kind of protection that this one here gave me. And the last real positive I'll give you is it's also probably the cheapest, if not the cheapest one that I got. So obviously that's a huge plus if you're on a budget. And then lastly, this one will sit a little bit lower than the Generation 2 and Generation 3. So if for some reason you really need that board low to the ground, if maybe you have somebody elderly or somebody that's just really short, like kids getting into your car all the time, then maybe this one could be a benefit for you. Maybe some other characteristics might shoo you away from that also. Right, now some of the downsides. Although this one does have some kind of like cool shapes, it doesn't have any of that Cybertruck specific little cutouts that you'll see on Generations 2 and 3. Also, this one here has the rounded edges. I kind of call these like the Nerf style. Now for a while I had a bumper on the front of the truck that also had this rounded Nerf edge, and it really matched this. Well, now I've gone away from that to a little bit more boxy style, which makes a Generation 2 and 3 a little bit more fitting to what I have, but that was a knock that a lot of people had on this one in particular. And lastly, probably the biggest criticism on this is while it only had 4 brackets, Generation 2 and 3 have that 5th, these brackets, at least one of them, covered up one of what the truck calls a lift point, a spot where you would put your jack. Now there are ways around that, and I'm sure you could figure it out. It was still a pretty big downside that 2 of your 4 lift points were covered by a bracket. Future generations, you'll see, fix that issue. Now, while this was not as complicated as the 4th one I have, the motorized one, it was significantly more complicated to put onto the truck as compared to the 2nd and 3rd generation. Your brackets were a lot more complex. It really mattered which one went where. They were side specific, but also order specific. There were spacers. There were all kinds of different, 2 different sizes of nuts and bolts. So just a lot of complications. Even the little spacers to where how the bracket actually mounted the board itself was all pretty tricky, to be honest with you, and it was much more simplified in Generation 2. This leads me to Generation 2, the 2nd running board I put on my truck that I have now reinstalled for, like, I don't know, the 2nd or 3rd time on my truck just for this video. Some of the plus sides this particular running board had is it was a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. You can see there I have some of like the emblems, that little Cybertruck kind of logo put on there, and there's some little dashes, and it's the fact that it's like edgier, it doesn't have any of those bars or those round tubing, made it feel more Cybertruck, all edgy and sharp angles. Also on this one, the simplicity of install came into place. Instead of having these angular graphics who were not only side specific, but also order specific, meaning 1, 2, 3, 4, it simplified it to have just a single bracket that looks something like this. Now there was still an L and an R to make sure they were on the left or the right side of the truck, so they were side specific, they were not order specific. Now some of the downsides of this are, which I'm splitting hairs a little bit, is some of these little holes like you see here were a little on the large size. Although it's nice to have some kind of opening where like ice and snow and water buildup wouldn't just set on there, it could go through. I mentioned on a previous video, my wife out to dinner one night with me had a high heel go through one of these, and had I not been right there holding her hand, she would have literally fallen because the heel sunk through these. Now this is a thing that we'll talk about in Generation 3, they kind of improved on this a little bit, but again, I like the look. Again, the Cybertruck logo you can see there, really cool. I like the dash, maybe just a little bit too large of an opening. And the last difference, not really a plus or a minus, but this Generation 2 sat right at the level of the truck, whereas the Generation 1 sat just underneath the level of the truck. And in an attempt to give this particular running board a little bit more dimension, you can see they put a little bit of a bevel onto this. At face value, without actually using it, I thought, hey, that's great. It looks cool, a little bit more texture, a little bit more design. The problem was it was really easy to slip off the edge of these. I didn't need any more angular down where I was stepping. Again, especially like a lady with more of like a dress shoe, this became just a tad riskier than what I would have liked. Again, not a terrible thing, but it was a factor. Now, the biggest factor, what I thought was the biggest difference, was this particular bracket. Now that there was 5 and not 4, of course it's one more bracket, no longer covered that lift point. So now you could easily access all 4 of these points. If you had to jack up your car at any of your 4 corners, it was no longer a problem because these new brackets avoided those spots altogether. And again, to show you the good, the bad, and the ugly, you'll notice these little brackets, specifically this one here and this one up here, got mangled pretty good. But obviously I hit something underneath. Could be one of, I don't know, a half dozen times where this could have happened. I don't know the exact time, but the thing is, I didn't notice it. It wasn't until I was actually taking these off one time where I noticed how bad these had gotten mangled, and they still worked. I still, I'm sure, stood on them to get in and out of the truck and just never quite noticed what they were. So there's a chance that this saved my truck from some damage. Now, I don't know. Maybe if my truck was sitting higher, it wouldn't have touched this. There's also a chance that maybe I just bottomed out on something, and that had I not hit this bracket, I would have hit my truck. But I do tend to think that this damage was actually from a complete bottoming out, because it is the second and third bracket that is messed up on this side, and it's the second and third brackets that are jacked up here on the other one also. So I had these both on my truck for about a month, one on each side, just to kind of see how it was, the differences. So the fact that both the second and third are messed up, meaning I had to pretty equally bottom out, which means it probably, whatever I hit, would have hit the bottom skid plate of my truck. So there's another maybe vote of confidence for having a running board, that it probably protects your truck. That brings me to these Generation 3 running boards. And as you can see, they still have little cutouts. They still give you that little cybertruck kind of a logo. But if you notice, these gaps are much smaller than those previous ones. So the issue I mentioned with the high heel going through would no longer be an issue for these. Now, these have a lot of similarities to those Generation 2, not the least of which is these also sit at the same exact level. They also have very similar brackets with one difference. The Generation 2 bracket that I have here were not order specific, but they were side specific. Again, you see that little L being the left side. If you notice here, there's just one octagonal hole cut out of these. This Generation 3 bracket, which looks about the same, has 2 little holes. What this does, if you notice, there's no letter. These are not order specific or side specific, which made the install of this really easy. You just had 10 brackets and it really didn't matter which one went where. And the fact that these still line up in those 5 different spots, again, still not covering any lift points, made it just really simple to install. This Generation 3 also cut out that bevel I talked about earlier. These just have a straight 90-degree edge from where they come off. But the downside to these a little bit thinner boards, I hit something very small, very slight with the Generation 3s here, and it dented my running board. You see, I have this nice little nick in my running board. That came from hitting something, just barely bumping a little pole somewhere that I knew I was gonna bump, and honestly thought it'd be okay, and it dented it. I was a little disappointed by that, and I think that's just the nature of what's gonna happen with these because this steel is just so thin. There's no way this trusty Gen 1 would dent like that Generation 2 or 3 did. And the last thing I wanna show you with the Generation 3 running board, but obviously I hit something because you can see this second bracket as well as the middle bracket bent pretty good. Now, this part here was facing the front of the truck, so obviously I hit something going forward, which would make sense. Hit that pretty good to warp it like that. Then it hit this one pretty good to warp it like this. Now, the second one is still fine, and the top one is still fine. I don't know if this is to say this is a low quality, or if it's to say these saved me from probably bottoming out and scraping up my truck. Not sure which it is, but for whatever that's worth, that's what the Generation 2, and probably it's nearly identical to what the Generation 3 would look like. Now, I guess the silver lining is this little end part here, which is what actually kind of hooks underneath the truck, is still right where it should be. And obviously the bolt that was in here was still in there and it was unfazed. So actually, I think it held its integrity despite the fact it's pretty warped. I really love the Gen 3 with these little simplified brackets. Super easy. It was the easiest to assemble of all the ones I had yet. It was the most practical. I honestly thought this would probably be what I had on there for life, but then they came out with a 4th set. So a quick recap of the 4 of them together, just talking about general width. The first, second, and third are about the same, whereas the 4th is a little bit more narrow. As far as thickness, the first one is a little bit more oblong, whereas the second, third are almost identical thicknesses, and the first one is slightly thicker. Now it's time for the 4th and final set of running boards, and that's the electric ones that extend out from the truck as soon as you hit that little button to open the door. Well, I'll get into this later, but if you're doing any kind of off-roading or if you're as hard on your truck as I am, I don't know. I'd have to think twice about this electric one. Now, obviously, this set is quite a bit different than the previous 3 we've just discussed. The main which is the install process that I'll talk about. Obviously, these took quite a bit longer to install compared to those first 3 generations. First 3 had no electrical to it. It was all just mounting either on 4 or 5 brackets on the bottom of the truck. These mount in 2 different spots. They're 2 different brackets. As you can see there's the back and then the front. There's so much more involved with these. I had to remove that whole entire front area. There was control boards, wirings. There was things I was plugging in, stretching out. I had to remove all different kinds of flarings. I was running cable. So of course they had quite a bit more to do. But that being said, if you're even remotely handy and you have a few hours, it's still well within the capabilities of installing these. Second main difference is we'll talk about clearance, both while it's open and while they're retracted underneath. Now, the first generation running board sat just underneath, so you actually had lower clearance or less clearance because they sat just a little bit lower. The second and third generation sat right here at that level of the plastic, so they sat a little bit higher. These, of course, tuck totally underneath. Now, that being said, they actually do a pretty good job tucking under there, even better than what I initially thought. You can see as these retract back in, they actually tuck in really snug, but even that being said, you can see that main bracket there, and even more importantly, the bracket and the motor here underneath. So what's that mean for clearance as far as off-roading or overlanding, things like that? You are going to sit significantly lower. And what I mean by significantly, probably 1.5 inches lower as compared to generations 1, 2, and 3. Now, there is a flip side of this, which actually could be a net positive depending on how you use your truck, which I'll get to in a second. But if you are looking to do that off-roading, there is a significantly higher chance you're going to drag this underneath. And this is much worse to drag this one compared to the 3 sets because obviously you have a hydraulic motor on this one. So if you damage that, your boards aren't going to work in and out. With that being said, this electric set here is quite a bit more expensive than any of the previous generations. Okay, so what is that one benefit I mentioned to these being a lower clearance? Well, they do sit lower to the ground, which is going to make it quite a bit easier for people to get in your truck. Now, if you are a little on the short side, or if you are older, or if you have small children like I do, it's actually something to think about. So my truck right now is at the highest lift it could possibly be. And if you notice here, I'm just lifting up my foot this slight little bit to get on this. And it's actually quite a bit easier to access this running board. It's actually a running joke that I have with my wife that I'm gonna do it at his and at her side. On my side, I'm gonna get the Generation 3, and on her side, it's gonna go a little bit lower. It'll be this retractable running board. Now, I don't think we're actually gonna do that, but it is worth thinking about. And there's the thing I addressed in the previous 3 generations are, how do you jack this up and my covering lift points? I mentioned Generation 1 totally covered one, whereas the second and third totally avoided it. Well, this one here also avoids those jack points. Well, kind of. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to show you underneath the truck as I lay here on the ground. So this spot right here is your lift point, and it is kind of open. As you can see, you can't even read the words lift point because this part of the bracket here is covering it, but it is under there. So you could reasonably still get a bottle jack to this point here and jack it up, but not ideal. Let me show you the rear lift point, and this is important. So as you look again underneath the truck, you can see right there, there's your lift point, totally unobstructed. That is, until I shut this door. Now you see that lift point, well, while not totally covered, is slightly covered. It cuts off about 1/2 to 3/4 of that, and I barely have access to get to this. Now, of course, you could just say open the door, but if you think about it, if you're trying to jack up your truck, it's because you have a flat tire or something's wrong and you could be on the side of the road, and now you're having to open this door just to expose that jack point. Not the worst thing, but also not ideal. So all that being said, which running board should you get if you're looking, and which am I going to stick with? I think that question has a whole lot to do with how are you using your truck. If you are regularly off-roading, if you are regularly bottoming out, if you've noticed you've had multiple flat tires, you've cracked all your mud flaps off, go take a look underneath your truck. If you notice a bunch of scrapes, well, I don't know if the electric is the best option for you because they are going to sit lower, and there's a really high chance you're going to bang into those. Now, if you're deciding between Generation 1 and Generation 2, well, I would just go with whatever look kind of works best for you. I would definitely lean towards that third because all the brackets are the same and the install is going to be the simplest. And both that second and third generation are totally free of lift points. But what do you say about that third generation? So this here is just a big bull bar I used to have in my truck. I liked this because it perfectly matched that first generation of running boards that also had this like hollow bar, this Nerf style running board. If you had something like this in your truck, then that Generation 1 matched perfect, and I might lean that way. But with the rare exception of you trying to match a bull bar like that, I would definitely lean towards Generation 2 or 3 if I was going to be going off-roading. But if you are in that category of people where you're like, I only drive on pavement, maybe I'm a tradesman, or maybe you're just a business person of some kind, or a mom of some kind, that's just carting your kids around, and you're like, I don't really drive off-roading. I'm not going over boulders. I've taken a look underneath my truck. It's not all scratched up. Maybe you're a little shorter, you are a little elderly, or somebody that fits those two descriptions is regularly a passenger in your vehicle, then I kind of like these electric running boards because they do get really low to the truck. And then the last raw benefit of this, I have not tested this data myself, but supposedly these running boards that tuck underneath the electric do save you in gas mileage because there's less drag. I could definitely believe that, although I couldn't imagine it'd be more than 2, 3, maybe on the high end 4%. But if you're really trying to maximize yourself on road trips and you're not worried of bottoming it out, maybe this is truly the best option for you. As for me, what would I pick? Well, I'm probably leaning towards the route of leaving the ones I paid the most amount of money for on my truck, and I'm just going to be a little bit more careful on if I'm off-roading on these. And I may even look into doing the his and hers, putting the Generation 3 back on the driver's side and leaving the electric ones here on the passenger side for my wife to get in and out. Or something I might do is I've looked into building a little cage to try to protect that little motor underneath. If I do that, you can better believe it, I'll make a video about it. Nonetheless, if any of these boards are of any interest to you, or something you might want to put on your truck beyond just watching me make a fool and spend all my money, I'll put the link to all 4 of these down in my description below. And if anything you want from all these different carriers, if you use my channel name Charisma, I'll get you a nice little discount at checkout. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.